right? Then we have to look at this question, just a negative one as well. In this example, the sketch below is a graph of fx equals the minus log x with base 2. I think you know what we have there, learners. Just that is what we call a log graph. Remember, it's given there as log, but why do we know it's a log? Because a log graph is a graph that normally cuts the x-axis at 1. Right? Question number 1. Write down the domain of f. So, okay, learners, there was somebody asked me how to explain the domain again. Let's have a look at what or how can we get the domain. Well, number 1, what is the meaning of the word domain? Domain says, I want to know what are all the possible x values of this graph, right? All the possible x values. We will see again in this example, this is our asymptote. Remember what we said? So this graph cannot go through or touch it. So it will go closer and closer to 0, but it will never touch, right? Remember again, domain means x value. So the possible x values for this graph is it cannot touch the y-axis, so it's at the point 0, and it's going to infinity in this direction. Now there's two ways of writing it, yes. We can say number 1, the domain means x is greater than 0. I hope you understand that, right? X is greater than 0. Or another way of writing it is that x is an element and it's between 0 to infinity, right? I say Unati, Roddy, Samwabe, Franklin, visitors, Dunati. I see Lucanio. Whoa, learners, I see what I see on the screen, definitely the correct answers. So thank you very much to you. Just one small, Lucanio, just be a bit careful on the way you wrote it. It cannot be a block bracket. Let me just explain why. When you have a block bracket in maths, especially when it comes to graph, it means it includes that value as well, right? The round bracket says you exclude. Now remember, you cannot include 0. Why do I say that? 0 is your brick. That's your asymptote. And as I said earlier, you cannot touch or go through an asymptote. So you cannot be equal to 0. So just be careful for not writing the block bracket, but it has to be the round bracket. The round bracket says it exclude the equal to sign. So it's only values greater than 0. Okay? I hope you understand that, but thank you very much for your answer. Right. Question 4.2. They ask you now, write down the equation of f to the power minus 1, the inverse of f in the form y equals. Now learners, by now you are so used to writing from the one graph to the inverse, right? But it's in this example, it's given as a log graph. So remember, it's given as fx equals negative the log of x with base 2. But what we know, it also means y equals negative log of x with base 2, right? That's a negative log graph. Now, if you think very carefully, you know it's going to be quite obvious that your answer should be a negative exponential graph, right? It should be a negative exponential graph. Back to our golden rule. What is the most important? I see Eben is jumping the gun, but thank you very much for that. Eben says, number 1, sir, swap the x and the y. Thank you very much for that. So if we swap it, we are going to say x equals negative the log of y with base 2, right? And I see Lungisa is also giving me the answers. Thank you very much to you too. But let's just see how we do have to write this into exponential form. Remember, what we have here is a log form, so we have to write it into exponential form. Now remember, reading this is the log of y is your number, 2 is your base, and that is your exponent. Right? Remember the definition of a log. It says the log of a number, in this case the log of a number is y. I will say again, 2 represents your base, and then x represents your exponent. Now getting that answer, we're going to write y, that's the number, equals to your base, it's 2, and then your exponent is going to be negative x. You probably know why I'm writing negative x, right? Why? Because the inverse graph of a negative log graph is a negative exponential graph. And we know obviously that we can also write into another form. We're going to say y equals to, we can also write it as a half to the power of x. Right? If you write any one of the two, you obviously will get the same answer. Okay? Now let's just look at 4.3. They ask you to write down the equation of the asymptote of f to the power minus 1. I think by now you're going to say, learners, oh sir, please, you know we can't do it with closed eyes. That shouldn't be a problem. Because as we know, the asymptote for the log and the exponential graph is going to be, yes, y is equal to 0. Right? Then the last question on this is they ask you, explain how using the graph of f you would sketch the graph. Remember, they don't ask you to sketch it. Okay, what I did over here for better understanding is I'm giving you the answer here. Maybe if you look at the answer, you'll be able to give it to me in words. And remember, if you get that exponential graph, you don't have to work it out. You can sketch the inverse graph immediately. Right? If it's positive, you know how the inverse graph look of that. So, whatever graph they give you, you can, without calculation, give the inverse. And by doing that, it might give you a better idea on how to put it into words. Now, let's just look at this. So, the graph what's given here is at fx, right? Where it says fx equals a negative log x with base 2. That was given. So, they ask you now, explain how we would sketch the graph of gx. And gx is going to be the log x with base 2. What is different? Have a look at it carefully. This is fx. They want to know if you must sketch gx, which is log of 2x, we know it's that one. What happened from this one to that one? Do you maybe have an idea? Look at it carefully. What happened, or what can you tell me? How can you explain that to me? Right? How can we move from this one to that one? Right? I see Langisa is already giving me the second answer. Saki, you're a star, man. You're a star. He says, yes, sir, the only way we look at that is that we need to reflect. Absolutely. It's a reflection about the x-axis. If you look at that carefully, you see there's our mirror. So if we take this graph and we reflect it that way, it will give us gx. So absolutely what we have to write down is, we will say that's going to be a reflection, right, about the x-axis. Absolutely. Right? Okay, and the last one, 4.4.2, where it says, how would you sketch now hx, which is the next graph? And the next graph, hx, is this one, which is the exponential graph. Now, if you look at this very carefully, there's a log graph. From there, we get the exponential graph. And then secondly, we have a negative 5 at the back. What does it mean, firstly, with that? Okay, let me see if I have some answers. Right? I see it's a reflection. All says reflection. Absolutely. Thank you very much to all of you. I see I'm getting the correct answers. What we can see here, hx, can you see is the inverse of gx? Look at it very carefully. Hx is the inverse of gx, because gx is the log graph, the positive one. Hx is a positive exponential graph. So in other words, number 1, right, we're going to say there the inverse of gx, let me just write that again, it's the inverse of gx. And then, what does minus 5, what does it mean? And I say I already got the answer here from Lungisa. We said, sir, minus 5 means, secondly, it will shift down 5 units. Right? It will shift down 5 units. Right. Then just lastly, just to reflect on what we have covered there, if you look at the slide, we have there, we've started off with y equals 2 to the power x. Remember, that was our positive exponential graph. From there, the inverse of that, it gave us y equals the log of x with base 2, the inverse of that graph. Then we've also looked at y equals 2 to the power minus x, the negative exponential graph. And then from there, we went on to and reflect that where we have y equals the log of x with base a half. Right? So that is what you see, the summary that I can show you of all the work we have covered. Okay, learners, I hope that in today's session, that you have quite a good understanding when it comes to the exponential graph and obviously the inverse graph, which is a log graph. As you can see, it's not that difficult. Try to understand basic concepts. All graphs, as I've mentioned, go through y is equal to 0, y equals to, through the point y is equal to 1. Y equals to 0 is your asymptote. Remember, if you sketch the exponential graph and you need to sketch the log graph, swap x and y, plot those points, and you will have that answer. And that also shows you that is a reflection about the line y is equal to x. So all the advice that I can give you, remember maths, pen to paper. There's no other ways to study that. So from me, have a nice exam and good luck to that. Thank you very much. See you next time.